Okay, so just to wrap up the last couple concepts in Chapter 5 that you need to focus on. And here we're going to talk about limiting resource. So just to sum up what a limiting resource, again, is an environmental resource that, because it's scarce or unfavorable, restricts the ecological niche of an organism. So it restricts where an organism is able to survive, or how easily an organism is able to survive. So a food availability could be one of these limiting resources, but one of the best examples is water salinity. So how salty your water is. I mean, think of the difference between freshwater and saltwater fish. If you take a tropical fish from a tropical fish tank and you stick it into a bowl of fresh water, what happens? That fish dies. That's because it's not tolerant in such low salinities. And the same is true the other way around. You can't take a freshwater fish and stick it in a tropical tank because it's going to die due to the high salinity content. So the optimum range of salinity is known for various fish species, and fish cannot survive with a salinity too high or too low beyond what they are tolerant of. So salinity is a good example of a limiting resource. Now, although we might not think of it as a resource, it's a limiting factor. It is an attribute of an ecosystem that limits or restricts the ecological niche of an organism. So you can review all of this stuff. The symbiosis are pretty straightforward, and you have a video on that. The last thing I want to talk about is succession. So succession is how a community develops. Now, when we think of a community, don't just think animals, think plants also. And in order for a community to develop, all of the food in the food chain starts with your producers. It starts with your autotrophs. That is the first level of food development. And then you have your primary consumers that eat only vegetation. And then you have your secondary consumers that eat other animals. And so that process continues, but it starts with the plants. And plants don't just grow out of nowhere. They grow through the process of succession. And this is the order. We have two different types of succession. You'll need to know this. It will be on a quiz. And those are primary and secondary succession. Now, primary succession starts with the rocks. So imagine a lava flow where new volcanic rock has recently cooled and crystallized. Or imagine a flooded region where all of the soil has been removed and the bedrock is exposed. All of these types of areas where we are starting with a rock, that is the first step in primary succession. You start with a rock. And the first thing to grow on that rock are lichens. Now, lichens are those little fibery looking organisms that you see on rock surfaces. That you also see them sometimes on trees, but typically you see them on rocks. Lichens are one of the only organisms that actually eat rock as a food resource. They are able to secrete an enzyme that breaks down the rock, and they absorb some of the mineral content, and that is what a lichen feeds on. So lichens eat rocks. That's what they do, and they're one of the only organisms that can. And this process is crucial to the development of a soil, because without those lichens breaking down the rock material, you wouldn't have a medium in order for the next steps of vegetation to essentially plant roots. So you have your lichens, they eat their rocks, and they create a little home for moss spores. And moss spores collect in the fibers of the lichen, and they begin to grow and essentially feed partially off the lichen. It creates a substantial ground for the moss to grow, and then the moss, of course, is carrying out photosynthesis, but they're also sucking up nutrients from that very, very young, very immature soil through the lichen. And then with the mosses, once they start to grow and develop, that is able to catch grass seeds, and the grass seeds take root within the moss. But you cannot have a grass seed grow directly on a rock. It just doesn't work that way. That's not how it happens in nature. You have a rock, you have a lichen that feeds on that rock, that creates a home for moss spores. Moss spores grow, and then you get your grass. And this process continues, and various generations of the moss and the grass vegetation die and add organic material to the newly developing soil. That creates a substantial medium for shrubs to grow. So as this process continues, your soil thickens due to the weathering process, lichens breaking down the rocks and sucking up the nutrients from it, mosses growing, essentially dying and adding their organic material back to the soil that enriches the organic material in the soil, as well as do your grasses and pretty much anything else that is laid to rest on a soil floor. And then you get your shrubs, and then eventually you get your trees. But that is the process. It doesn't happen any other way. It is rock, lichen, moss, grass, shrub, tree. Now, maybe you all have seen a crevice in a rock, maybe hiking in the Adirondacks or something, where there appears to be a tree sprouting from that crevice. If you go up to that tree, if you could take that tree off of its tiny little crevice where it looks like it's growing directly from the rock, you would find that that tree has grown on a soil that has developed from lichens, mosses, and grasses. So again, here is the primary succession showing you the barren rock surface. And so we have rock, then lichens, then moss, grasses, shrubs, and eventually your large trees. This is a mature community housing multiple different populations of organisms with a thickened, mature soil that is able to support complex vegetation. This process is crucial for sustaining life on the planet. Then the other type of succession that we have starts essentially with a field. Okay, so a lot of times this happens where farmlands have been abandoned, or where there has been a forest fire that eradicated all of the vegetation, but you're left with a soil. It's an old soil, but it's a soil nonetheless that had previously developed. And so what eventually develops on this soil, and it takes far less time than primary succession, is you start to get your grasses. They can grow first because you already have your soil there, you already have your organic material, hopefully some nutrients are left over in that soil, and your grasses can take root. And then you get various weeds, little shrubs and trees and saplings, and then eventually it matures into your larger vegetation like your trees. And so the process of secondary succession is much quicker than primary succession because you are starting with a pre-existing soil. You do not have to start from scratch with a rock like primary succession. So that's the difference. Primary succession starts with the rocks, and secondary succession starts with a pre-existing soil.